session, it discusses much more about the impact of COVID-19 on the actions of non-state actors. Thank you again. Yes, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much. Thank you.
The guns in Africa within the context of COVID-19, conflicts and non-state actors. Introductory remarks by the Deputy Chairperson of the African Union. On behalf of His Excellency the Chairperson of the African Union, the President of South Africa, His Excellency President Matamela Cyril Ramaphosa, and the Chairperson of the African Union Commission, Dr. Musa Faki Mahamat, I should like to thank the Royal United Service Institute for Defense and Security Studies for hosting this event, which brings together all of us to deliberate on Africa's future, Africa's security, and Africa's prosperity. The African Union continues to take steps to silence the guns and to end wars in Africa. To this end, a solemn declaration was adopted by our Assembly on the 25th of May 2013, which undertook not to bequeath war to the next generation of Africans. This solemn declaration was also a statement of our leaders' intention to open more opportunities for building prosperity across the African continent. Now, if today wars have not totally ended, it is certainly not for want of trying. The advent of the coronavirus in December 2019, which was declared by the World Health Organization, WHO, as a pandemic in March 2020, has clearly negatively impacted the international system. Africa certainly is no exception. Our Peace and Security Council is working hard to rise up to the challenge. It has sought to provide strategic direction in Africa's war against the COVID-19 pandemic. The Peace and Security Council has facilitated the opening and the provision of air corridors and humanitarian corridors to backstop efforts against COVID-19. Our African Ministers of Health have played their role, providing momentum, providing political support and orientation to the African Centers for Disease Control. The Chairperson of the African Union Commission, His Excellency Dr. Musa Faki Mahamat, and the United Nations Secretary General, Dr. Guterres, called on all belligerents to stop fighting and to ensure cessation of hostilities. They both stressed the moral and humanitarian obligation for all warring parties, wherever they may be in Africa, to immediately stop fighting to facilitate the measures being undertaken by member states and other actors to combat and defeat the coronavirus pandemic. This virtual meeting we're having today is taking place at an increasingly difficult period, given the escalation of the COVID-19 pandemic with heightened infections and spread across the world and in Africa. In this context, I wish to pay tribute to all African Union member states for their efforts deployed to contain and defeat the coronavirus. This is, however, work in progress, and we all have our work cut out for us. Non-state actors, however, do not appear to have heeded the calls made by the African Union Commission Chairperson and the United Nations Secretary General to observe and uphold cessation of hostilities. This complicates our efforts to address the challenge, but not everything is bleak. In Darfur, Sudan, most of the armed groups announced cessation of hostilities to mitigate the security and humanitarian conditions and to facilitate anti-COVID-19 measures, even if not entirely. In Mozambique, fighting has been reported in Cabo Delgado region, with terrorists and insurgents attacking and displacing populations. The overspill of terrorism and extremism to this country poses the risk of spreading this scourge to the rest of Southern Africa. In Libya, the belligerents have been fighting, exacerbating an already dire situation for civilians. This has further worsened the situation of migrants and asylum seekers and aggravated an already difficult and challenging socioeconomic situation in the country. Al-Shabaab in Somalia has not heeded the call for cessation of hostilities, dismissing COVID-19 as foreign propaganda. Al-Shabaab has intensified mortar attacks on AMISOM, planting IEDs, as well as armed attacks on the Somali National Army. Reports show that the group's persistent attacks are already negatively impacting on the COVID-19 response in Somalia. In the Lake Chad region, Boko Haram terrorist groups continue with attacks in Chad. In Nigeria, amidst the challenges imposed by the COVID-19 pandemic, the Sahel region also continues to experience intercommunal violence and attacks by terrorist groups. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, continued terrorism and intercommunal violence has cumulatively resulted in forced displacement of sections of the population. Generally, therefore, the continuation of hostilities on the continent is complicating our fight against COVID-19. Our humanitarian support activities, our peace efforts, and the implementation of the Silencing the Guns project in Africa. To conclude, therefore, I would like to highlight that paradoxically, even as the COVID-19 pandemic has caused tremendous suffering and economic disruption globally, it has also caused Africa and the whole world to undertake innovation, to rethink strategies and adapt and begin to see the need for global solidarity. Experience tells us that COVID-19 may not be the last pandemic to hit the human race. We're likely to see other pandemics. It is therefore of paramount importance that we continue to focus on international public health, both local, district, in all its aspects, and to improve preparedness on a global scale. I thank you for your kind and polite attention. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Yeah. Good afternoon. Thank you for tuning in and joining our long day and our panels today. This is the second panel of the day. My name is Martine Zeutner, and I'm a senior research fellow at RUSI, and I'm based out of the organization's Kenya office. I want to sincerely welcome you all to this second panel of today, which is called The Power of the Few, the Rise and the Spread of Non-State Armed Groups in Africa During a Crisis. And I think it's going to be a really excellent panel. We're going to be focusing on the role of armed non-state actors or violent extremist organizations. I can hear that others have touched upon it earlier, but we will go deeper. We are going to have a rich discussion around how these groups are responding to the current crisis of the pandemic, perhaps with some perspectives of how they've managed other crises in the past, and in particular, how their approach have changed over time since the pandemic started. And we are going to have panelists speak of different groups. We have a colleague who will touch on Boko Haram. We have a colleague who will discuss the insurgency in Mozambique. We will have perspectives from the Horn of Africa focusing on Shabab. And I wanted to first introduce our great speakers. The first speaker of this panel is Dr. Monde Myangwa. She's the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program, and she'll be joining us from Washington, I believe. The second speaker of this panel is Dr. Simon Nyambura, who's the director of the IGAD Center of Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism in Djibouti, however, currently managing everything out of Nairobi. Then we have the third speaker, Dr. Freedom Onuha, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Political Science at University of Nigeria, joining us from Enugu, I think, in Nigeria. The fourth speaker of today is Eric Moria Ganu. He's a senior lecturer in African history at Queen's University of Belfast, probably joining us from Belfast. And then finally, we have my colleague, Michael Jones, who's a research fellow in terrorism and conflict at our office in London. And before I hand over to our first speaker, I want to encourage you all to ask questions. We have given the panelists a short period of time for their remarks because we really want to engage with you, get your questions so that we can get a really good discussion going. I can see that Dr. Monde, who was the first planned speaker, has not yet arrived. So Simon, forgive me for handing the floor to you a little bit earlier than predicted, but Simon, if you don't mind, I would like you to be the first speaker, and then we'll, oh, I see, Monde is now here.
Okay.
Great, so allow me to hand over to Dr. Monde Myangwa, the director of the Wilson Center's Africa program. She was joining us from Africa. Please, over to you, Dr. Monde.
Thank you very much, Martine, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody, wherever you might be joining us from. And thank you also to RUSI for inviting us for this very important discussion. I think I have the easiest job of our panelists today, what I wanted to do is just give a very, very broad overview of how violent extremist organizations on the continent may be intersecting with the COVID-19 crisis, and what this means in terms of looking ahead to the future of VEOs and in Africa. So I know we have a very limited time, and since my job is the easiest, I'm going to go very quickly. I think there are 5 points that I want to make in terms of the intersection between VEOs and COVID-19 in Africa. The first point is that from where I sit, looking across the continent, since the emergence of COVID-19 in January 2020, we have not seen a significant change in terms of the VEO landscape as far as the key groups are concerned. So the same groups that were operating pre-COVID in December 2019 continue to dominate both the news, they continue to dominate their activities, they continue to dominate in presence. So these are the same groups that everybody has been talking about: Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab, JINIM, and its affiliates within the Sahel, and increasingly the group in northern Mozambique. So the key actors have not changed as far as VEOs are concerned. That's not to say that there won't be a fracturing or we won't get new VEOs come about, because COVID-19 is still an evolving crisis. So the second point that I want to make is overall, violent extremist organizations in Africa did not go into lockdown when governments went into lockdown. So what we have seen is a continuation of VEO activity in nearly all the regions, but an increase in terms of the number of attacks and lethality in some countries. Particularly we see this in northern Mozambique. We have also seen an increase in attacks in various parts of the Lake Chad Basin area and areas of the Sahel. So there has been no diminishment in terms of the activities of the VEOs. Rather, we have seen an increase in certain areas. I think as recently as there was the attack on June 15 by Boko Haram that killed 81 people in Borno State. We had the attack that killed 92 Chadian soldiers. We also had the attack in April in Mozambique that killed at least 52 people. So you do see this escalation in certain parts. So no lockdown for the VEOs. The third point that I want to raise is that the VEOs are taking advantage of the COVID crisis to recruit. They have issued statements that speak to that issue in terms of how they're framing the COVID crisis. We've seen statements from Boko Haram. We've also seen statements from El-Shabaab that aim to diminish the legitimacy of the state and international actors while elevating their own legitimacy, aiming to frame religion in a way that enables their recruiting. So there has been that strategic messaging around COVID-19 that a number of VEOs have undertaken. So I think that's a point, and I think some of my colleagues will go into that a little bit deeper. But I think the fourth area, and this is not so much what is happening now, but what is likely to happen in the future. The fourth point that I want to point out is it relates to African government measures and responses to COVID-19 and how these might play into the hands of the VEO. And these measures, such as states of emergencies, lockdown, social gatherings, and a ban on public gatherings, all of those make sense in terms of managing a public health crisis. And all of them make sense in terms of the emphasis that African governments have put on working on the prevention side of the crisis so that they can minimize the number of infections, because I think all African governments understand that they don't have the health infrastructure that could take care of an escalating or a rapid increase in infections. However, I think a number of points. The manner in which some of those measures are being implemented raises questions that could play into the hands of the VEOs. And I want to highlight three. The first one has to do with the lockdowns and the diminished reach of the state and the non-existent public service delivery, particularly to already marginalized areas. That's going to be a key issue. The second area has to do with security sectors, enforcement of lockdowns. There are videos out there of security sector forces in a very heavy-handed way enforcing the lockdowns. And so that's going to be an issue because it plays right into the alienation of the citizens from their government, the alienation and lack of trust between citizens and security forces. The third area that I think we need to look at for me is the brewing storm in terms of upcoming elections and government efforts to further restrict the democratic space. All right, so I think that's an area that we'll have to keep an eye on because that again could play into the hands of the of VEOs. And then all of these, the way that COVID-19 is accentuating governance challenges and deficits in Africa is likely to give VEOs a foothold. And so I think these are some of the issues that we ought to be looking at as we look at the trajectory and of VEOs on the African continent, as we look at how they might and take advantage of the COVID situation. So I'll end there and then turn it back to you, Martine.
Thank you so much, Dr. Monde. That was a great overview. I want to proceed to Dr. Simon, the Director of the Center of Excellence for Preventing and Countering Violent Extremism in Djibouti.
Yeah, thank you very much, Martini. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this forum, Rusi. Thank you very much for involving the IGAD CV Center and myself. Let me get to the point, and I think Dr. Monde has done a good job setting the stage. But I think it's good to put, because we have a very good topic, the rise and spread of non-state actors. And I think it's good for us to acknowledge that we ushered in 21st century where the extremists and non-state actors are really a big threat to the international system, the Westphalian state system as we know it. Today, I think the biggest threat we have is from non-state actors. And because Dr. Monde has given an overview, let me get right to the region, the Horn of Africa. And let me set the stage by stating these facts that, as we know, extremists by nature, and violent extremism for that matter, are very opportunistic in nature. And they are also very flexible and adaptable in terms of crisis. And therefore, it has been interesting for us to see how Al-Shabaab is going to adopt, how it's going to take advantage of the COVID-19 pandemic. And therefore, this poses the question, how has Al-Shabaab exploited or taken advantage of COVID-19? And in trying to respond to that question, I'll look at it from three levels. Has Al-Shabaab changed in terms of its strategies? Has Al-Shabaab changed in terms of its tactics? And tactics involves also techniques and processes. Has Al-Shabaab changed in its operation? And starting with the strategic point of view is that we could say Al-Shabaab in terms of strategy is that the lockdown and the over-sudden use of online by young people has really offered Al-Shabaab an opportunity to recruit. So strategically in terms of recruitment, we would say that Al-Shabaab is more active now online and trying to recruit followers online. Tactically, I would say we haven't seen much change in terms of tactics of Al-Shabaab, in terms of techniques, processes, they seem to remain the same. And I would say the same in the third level operation that we have seen in operating. Al-Shabaab has remained using the same tactics, using of ID. So nothing has changed as much as that. And therefore I would say Al-Shabaab has remained a true affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, as we saw, took a very pragmatic approach to COVID-19 compared to ISIL. While we would say all these extremists tried initially to argue that COVID-19 is a curse on infidels, I think the danger came to do even them, they were not immune. And therefore, while they continuously would encourage, Al-Shabaab has encouraged its followers to be careful of COVID-19. In terms of its behavior, it has continued to behave the same, no keeping social distance, no wearing mask, has continued to train as normal. So I would say it has adopted a very pragmatic strategy. Is there significant, could we say Al-Shabaab has significantly used COVID-19 to escalate its operations? I would say at this time, it's early to tell. I think we are still in a very early stage where there's a lot that we don't know. I think what I would say is perhaps a look into the future is that Al-Shabaab is likely to gain more followers for the reasons that Dr. Monde has mentioned. The lockdown will have immense economic impact on the region and the world as a whole. And therefore, we are going to have very many, and we are already seeing this, many young people who are kind of desperate. Many young people are losing jobs, can't access jobs. If we continue the way we are going, we'll have many people who can't afford food, and this will impact more on young people. And if Al-Shabaab will, as sometimes it does, try to provide basic needs, then it's likely to win followers on its side. And therefore, I think most of its impact, the impact of COVID-19 on violent extremism, we'll be able to see it perhaps in the next 6 months or so. And therefore, we would also dare say that perhaps post-COVID-19, we are likely to see more attacks, more vicious attack targeting the issue targets, because as we know, the lockdown has really limited in terms of soft targets that Al-Shabaab would target. So Martin, I think I wish to end there so that we can allow more time for discussion. Back to you.
Great, thank you so much, Simon. Now I want to hand over to Dr. Frida Monuha, who will be sharing some perspectives from more of the western part of Africa. Over to you, Doctor. You're on mute, please.
So thank you, Martinez. I think you can hear me now. Oh, good. Let me say that I'm quite pleased to be in this session for two reasons. I think I am living in an environment where the rise of extremist violence have really impacted on every aspect of society. But more importantly, I'm very happy with the kind of broad strategic background painted by Dr. Moyangwa and Dr. Nyambura. So my interventions to a very large extent will tend to tease from some of their issues, but more importantly, I will try to reinforce some of those comments from a broader regional perspective, speaking to some of the issues happening in the Sahel, but more importantly, I'm more specifically trying to draw further insight in terms of what is happening in West Central Africa, particularly the Chad region. And I'm very, very happy with what Dr. Muyangwa has actually mentioned. We've not really seen any fundamental increase in terms of the number and proliferation of violent extremist jihadist movement. What we have seen rather is a sense of maintenance and sustenance of attacks in the spaces where they have operated. Let's say, for example, in the broader Sahel region, I think the concentration of attacks have come out in two specific areas. First is what we call the Libta-Koguma region, which is actually a tri-border region of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. And the extremist violent groups are operating there are largely those that are affiliated to the Al-Qaeda network or the Al-Qaeda Center, particularly the Al-Qaeda in the land of Islamic Maghreb. We are talking about the GNI. Of course, we'll have the Islamic State in Greater Sahara being led by Abu Walid al-Sharawi, which is also affiliated to the Islamic State more generally. I think these areas have witnessed sustained attacks. But I think more importantly, if you recall that the Secretary General of the United Nations in May this year warned that actually that is likely going to see an increase of attacks during the pandemic. And that has to be understood against the backdrop of the recent attacks over the years, particularly in 2019, where that region, particularly the Libta-Koguma region, witnessed over 4,000 attacks compared to about 600 sometime last 6 years. But I think also we need to understand it within the context of what is happening in the region. This is a region that is characterized by poor governance, high youth unemployment, porous border, and heightened proliferation of small and large weapons. So these factors, to a very large extent, conspire to create a volatile environment where both violent non-state actors as well as ethnic militias like the Dogon and the Fulanis have also tried to protect themselves using violence. But if you look beyond the northern part of the Sahel, particularly the Libta-Koguma region, I think we have also seen a major concern in terms of the southern part of it, particularly in the Lake Chad region. I'm sure you know the Lake Chad region is actually a small spot within West Central Africa, having 4 riparian states, Chad, Cameroon, Nigeria, and Niger. And this region actually has played host to over a decade of violent extremist incursions and devastation, particularly posed by the group that is generally known as the Jamaat al-Husuna, Wild Jihad, or most people call them the Boko Haram. And of course, its linter group, the Islamic State West Africa province. These groups, particularly the JAS, led by Abubakar Shekau, and also the Islamic State in West African province led by Emir Abagana, have actually been a major source of concern because of the sustenance of attacks in the last decade. I, for one, do not see really in the context of the pandemic that we have seen a fundamental rise. I would prefer to use the word, I prefer to be much more measured to argue that what we have seen is more or less a sustenance of attacks by this group. But how have they exploited the pandemic? I think that we need to look at it from three broad perspectives. First, from the perspective of skillful rhetorics and narratives. Just like Mondi have mentioned, both the JAS, that is led by Abubakar Shakau, and the ISWAP have also tried to exploit narrative that casts the pandemic as a punishment, as a retribution by God against the infidels. But more importantly, also to cast it in such a way that gives the impression that their members are also immune to that virus, which is also very devastating. And that is related to what we need to know, because by casting it in such a way that it presents it as if it's a retribution of government against the infidels, they are trying to also make it very difficult for people to actually heed to the kind of containment and as well as strategic communication government is dishing in order to reduce their vulnerability to contracting that violence. The second one is also the fact that in a situation of extremist violence, it has forced the government within the region to make very tough decisions, particularly how we are going to right size and reallocate resources. Either you are going to use it to combat violence, or you're going to use it to combat a virus. And in this case, I think it played out so much in Nigeria because shortly before the uptick of this violence, we did see the Nigerian military particularly trying to develop some framework for what we call MACA, which is military assistance to civil authority, hoping that if the incidence of the virus escalate, the military should be able to actually deploy its critical assets to support the civilian authority to contain the spread. But I think what happened was that with the escalation of violence by the jihadi group, particularly the attack in March that killed close to 100 Nigerian soldiers, as well as the one also attack that killed close to 100 Chadian soldiers, we saw a major reallocation and redeployment of that military asset that was presumably set aside to support the civilian authority towards prosecuting the conflict. And of course, our chief of army staff relocated to provide the necessary moral boost to the troops. But I don't think that has actually changed anything fundamental, because we have also seen a sustenance of attacks, including even opportunist attack directed against the Dalori camp, in essence, which is just meant for the group in order to resupply and restore. But I think the very largest and the measures being taken by state forces are actually creating problem and pressure for the terrorist group, because it's also reducing the opportunity and the room for maneuver in terms of assessing certain logistics and some other issues. But I think a whole lot could be discussed around the context. I think you've seen the sign. Maybe in the final section, we could have much more time to reflect on that. Maybe I hand over to you, Martin, at this point.
Thank you so much, Dr. Freedom. That was excellent to hear your perspective and also touch about communication and those matters. Dr. Eric, I want to turn to you. Dr. Eric Morier-Gano, who is joining us from University of Belfast.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you to Rusi for organizing such an event. It's a great pleasure being in such a prestigious panel, very stimulating start. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about Mozambique, which is the last country being affected by jihadi violence, and unfortunately so, I suppose. The violence started in October 2017, so 2.5 years ago, when, rather to the surprise of most observers, the town of Mocimboa da Praia in the extreme north of Mozambique was attacked by a series of young men who went after the police station mostly. The attacks have then followed in subsequent months and have increased ever more, moving to the rural, to attacking small towns. And now we're at a stage where they're attacking district headquarters and police as well as military barracks. So the insurgency has intensified dramatically. There's much debate about the origin of the insurgency. But the people who've done field work in Cabo Delgado, which is the province where the insurgency is happening, have come to an agreement that it began with a sect very much like Boko Haram, which started probably 10 years before the insurgency began. And the sect was an Islamist sect, which was repressed and seemed to have shifted around 2015 or 16 to a jihadi agenda, an armed jihadi insurrection. They prepared and went on the attack in 2017. So the trajectory is probably to be thought about very much like Boko Haram, a similar trajectory. So we've gone 2.5 years now into this insurrection, and we counting over 1,300 dead, and this is just the account from media, 200,000 IDPs already, and it is affecting most particularly one province in the north of Mozambique. The government has been not very successful. We'd had difficulties dealing with insurgency. For one, it struggled to understand it, and then it had difficulties between the military and the police and understanding the tactics. It has managed, though, to contain the insurgency to half a province, the province of Cabo Delgado, which is an area of about 30,000 square kilometers, where the insurgency has remained for the last 2.5 years. Things change in mid-2019, on the one hand, because the insurgents connected and made a pledge to ISIS. And we have therefore seen ISIS playing all the media classics and laying claims to attack. And then the government on its side recruited mercenaries, at first Russian mercenaries, but that didn't work very well. Now South African mercenaries to help its operation with some success in recent months. The COVID crisis doesn't seem to have really affected the insurgency. I should say we have difficulties getting information because there's not of spin media, silence. Journalists are not allowed to, most journalists are not allowed to work in the area. But it seems, as Dr. Monde was saying, there's no increase in fighting, but there's no decrease either. I think maybe, particularly to Mozambique, maybe not. Things are continuing. The government is on the offensive and the insurgents have continued the attack in a fairly similar fashion. We have seen in the last couple of weeks a kind of a change. ISIS kind of fell silent, and there's suspicion that things may be readjusting. It's not very clear whether it's in relation to the government offensive or a change, possible change or consideration of change of allegiance. Al-Qaeda made a claim, the first claim it did in relation to Mozambique a month ago. So things seem to be changing. But overall, I think the situation is one where the insurgency have proved over 2.5 years that they can sustain the fight. They have connected to ISIS, mercenaries have come in, so the conflict, I think, is now going to last, and it will probably increase, which is what most people worry about. I'm sure we will get into a question about this. But I'll stop there, and thank you very much, Martin.
Great, thank you so much. Then I want to hand over to our fifth speaker of today, my colleague, Michael Jones, who's joining us from London.
Thanks, Martin. So clearly, as the other panelists have rightly highlighted, COVID-19 creates opportunities for militant groups and extremist outfits to exploit in strategic, discursive, and military terms. I just wanted to draw on work that I've been conducting with some colleagues in RUSI's Nairobi office. Just to emphasize that I also think COVID-19 potentially creates risks and indeed challenges for non-state armed groups as well, especially those like Al-Shabaab that already exercise a degree of territorial control. And I think this raises key questions over how such actors sort of manage the virus from an administrative and governmental standpoint that need to be explored. We've seen Al-Shabaab already express some sort of embryonic form of civic response. The virus featured in a consultative forum on jihad in East Africa. The group convened in March. It subsequently circulated rather pragmatic health advice and has since described the launch of a special committee to manage its response to the virus in territories under its control, and more recently announced a COVID-19 isolation facility replete with transport vehicles and a 24-hour hotline. Now, how far these claims reflect reality is obviously up for debate, given the difficulty of gathering concrete data on the group. And it's also likely that some of these measures are at the very least a sort of exercise in self-preservation, as much as they are in sort of public relations, given there are already rumors and some indications that elements of the insurgency have potentially contracted the virus. I think it's also worth highlighting, though, that this practical response to the pandemic potentially stems, at least in part, to the genealogy of al-Shabaab. The group derives from antecedent entities like the Union of Islamic Courts, which has experimented with models of governance in the absence of centralized state authority. Now, obviously, al-Shabaab is its own distinct actor, and we shouldn't overemphasize any sort of concerted hearts and mind approach in its activities. It clearly relies primarily on violence and intimidation to maintain territorial control. But I think in some of its previous sort of approaches, we can see some strategic and pragmatic considerations. It's previously marketed a particular sort of socioeconomic logic in some of its activities. It's displayed a degree of commercial and economic pragmatism in some of its operations, extorting less and in a more predictable way civilians in territories under its control compared to other sort of clan militias. It's advertised consistently its ability to impose some semblance of stability and security in territory under its control, and also to provide sort of relatively efficient forms of law and order. Collectively, these can sort of be considered as little solutions that in some way satisfy at least elements of the sort of day-to-day needs of populations under its control. I think in the context of COVID, what's a bit different is that the scale of the pandemic very well exposed the sort of intrinsic limitations of these solutions. So we've seen with previous experiences with the famine in Somalia in 2010, 2011, and episodes of cholera and measles in 2017, that Shabaab really lacked any sort of capacity and inclination to deal with the disaster. It often outsourced in a rather ad hoc fashion medical and humanitarian services to aid agencies and NGOs. Operations that were consistently insufficient, often extorted, and ultimately suspended after suspicions of Western espionage. And in this sense, they drastically exacerbated the fatalities and fallout of these crises. I think it's also clear that there's a paucity of medical infrastructure in areas under Shabaab's control. Whereas previously at its sort of zenith, it had a relatively centralized health department sort of running hospitals and towns and settlements under its control. This has largely collapsed following its territorial losses. And accounts are sort of varied, but there is some indication that it has access to sort of basic facilities, but lacks the sort of technical expertise, specialist equipment, and resources to really sort of manage or mitigate the spread of the virus. And this obviously leaves the populations in territories it controls highly vulnerable. I think this is quite important as al-Shabaab is now in a weaker position than it was during, for example, the famine of 2010. While never popular, it has experienced a significant backlash, not only for mishandling a lot of the previous humanitarian crises we've seen over the years, but also for various terrorist attacks, including the infamous bombing in Mogadishu in October 2017 that inflicted extremely high civilian fatalities. More recently, it's also been under military pressure after losing a series of strategically important towns, and has increasingly relied on a fluctuating series of local clan alliances. Now, obviously, there is a nucleus of committed ideologues within the group, and it does, display rigorous internal policing, but the insurgency doesn't function as a monolith. And there's at least a proportion of the rank and file that have joined, arguably due to pragmatic or opportunistic reasons, that may well be more focused on sort of providing for their families or communities the very dependents that will be most exposed to any sort of fallout from the virus. So just to conclude, I think under these circumstances, if it appears that al-Shabaab cannot provide an effective response to the pandemic, it seemed to be blocking healthcare access to constituencies it increasingly relies on, or it seemed to be outcompeted by other Somali actors in responding to the pandemic. I think it may find the sort of validity and capabilities of both its political project and also its military power being undermined. And in the process, this could well expose the limitations and inadequacies of militant governance. So I'll leave it there and pass it back to you, Martine.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. So that was the end of our panelists' opening remarks, and I really can't thank you enough for your remarks and notes We have a number of questions. Some of them I can see were for the previous speaker. So I want to start with one which I think I might hand over to Dr. Monde Mnyangwa and Eric Moria-Ganu. But the question is from a colleague called Ewan Grant. He is based in London and he's a former UK law enforcement and intelligence analyst with West Africa and Somalia experience. He's asking, will the potential for non-state actors, extremist groups to regroup while governments are distracted by COVID-19 lead to governments bringing in quote unquote non-state solutions in the form of private military contractors? He's saying that comments made about Libya by earlier panelists suggest that a national, Pan-African and international organizations are not well suited to respond. So I think Dr. Monde and Dr. Eric, it would be really interesting to hear your view on this, whether the groups might regroup and whether that might give space or the necessity of involving private security contractors. Please, Dr. Monde, would you be willing to start on this question?
I know that's a very interesting question. Actually, one I hadn't thought about previously. I think from my perspective, I struggle a lot with the use of non-state private security actors on the African continent, in part because their history on the African continent has not been a good one. And it has also gotten in the way, I think, of developing healthy civil-military relations within the African continent, which are so critical to resolving some of the governance issues that the continent is facing. So I would rather look at it as African governments, I think, need to revisit the roles and responsibilities of their current security forces and how those roles and responsibilities articulate with Africa's current security challenges. I think one of the most, the issues that I see is that in many ways, we still have this construct of the security forces that were inherited at colonialism, focused on with the end of colonialism, focused on the security challenges that prevailed then. We have not quite made that transition. So I think for me over the long term, it's how do we make that transition so that African security forces are better able to articulate with the challenges that it faces. I know that's a long-term project, but I do think that's something that needs to be taken care of. In the immediate sense, I really don't know what the answer to that would be. Having said that, though, we do have security forces on the continent. They're not all trained to deal with violent extremism. So I think a part of it has to do with how quickly can African governments train their forces to deal with those security issues. I think I'll leave it there. Not a satisfactory answer, but I think I'll leave it there.
No, this is a speculative question. I think that was an excellent answer. Dr. Eric Moria-Ganu, would you want to add something in your understanding of the group in Mozambique?
Well, yes, we've had private military contractors over the last year in Mozambique, year and a half possibly. Both Wagner, the Russian private military contractor, then some South African Rhodesian actor now. And I think both of them have shown to be not adequate. Wagner failed and withdrew, which is quite unusual. And DAG, which is the organization now working in Mozambique, is facing difficulties because of the means. It doesn't have enough means, it doesn't have men on the ground, so they're basically flying helicopters and a few drones. I wholly agree with Dr. Monde. I think this investment should be on the African military, and I think that's there's no question about that. There's a debate in Mozambique, and I think regionally, whether there should be an external intervention to help the Mozambican army, and the discussion is whether it's private military contractors or whether it's an intervention from neighboring countries. And the SADC, Southern Africa Development Corporation, community was favorable to helping Mozambique, but the question is how and who, etc. Some are saying, well, the UN should move in, but then again, it's not that easy. So the question to my mind is, PMC maybe in the short run, but it depends which PMC, which private military contractors, and the one we have now are obviously not very good. So maybe another one. And the question is to do what? If it is to fly drones, intelligence, to support and to train the army, yes, that sounds constructive. If it is to have, in this case, white men running around, not knowing where they are, not used, because that was a problem of the Russian. They had no intelligence, they didn't articulate well with the army, and it was a disaster. Some of the men were caught, decapitated. It was just a disaster, which they managed to kind of hide. But this is a disaster in waiting. So the question is, I think, needs to be kind of made more complicated as to what they could do. But I suppose, you know, it doesn't need to be necessarily private to get drones flying, etc. So I think we need to refine, but I would agree wholly with Dr. Monde. I think the investment should be done into the local armies, the national armies, to help them get the means and the training to actually face these VOE, as the term was used.
Yeah, great indeed. Challenging time and changing time, so that all of us perhaps need to think about the responses in new ways. We have a new question. It's from a colleague called Nana Mante, and she's asking, does anyone in the panel have insight on how these groups, Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab, are funding their activities in these difficult and unusual times? And I think this question is very suitable for Dr. Frida Monuha and Dr. Simon Nyambura, and perhaps Michael Jones with a couple of quick remarks. And Frida, I know you also wanted to comment briefly of the previous question. That's in order, of course. So please, the floor is yours. How do they get funding at this time, Dr. Frida?
Well, thank you very much. I think that's very important question and very critical one. I think we need to also understand it within the larger context of the three pillars that support terrorist organizations. Terror groups survive based on the ability to exploit three things. First is ideology, second is recruitment, and third is money, funding. And if you look at the experience of the Boko Haram in particular, I think that our group has proven so adept and very creative in generating funds depending on the dynamics of the operative environment they found themselves. Originally, the Boko Haram, as the person that posed the question may wish to know, originally Boko Haram tend to fund its operation from membership dues. As the environment changed, they moved into armed robbery as well as raiding of Burudu change. As the security agencies begin to interdict them on these directions, they've also evolved towards kidnapping for ransom, which have played a very key part. And even at the height of their occupation of territories in the Northeast, particularly in 2013 to 2015, they were collecting taxes, what we call jizya, which is a kind of tax imposed on those who live in territories where they control, whether the person is running petroleum business, whether the person is operating a shop, any kind of business that you're operating, they used to tax them. But with the development of the Boko Haram and forcing them to have a very small area in terms of confines, they've also proven adept in changing their funding streams. The JAS group, the one we call the Jamaat al-Husna Leader Wal Jihad, that is led by Abubakar Shekau, which operates more of the northern part of Borno, tend to leverage cattle rustling. You know, they tend to leverage cattle rustling for funding its operation, and that is something that has proven extremely very difficult. And I think, again, it's very important we even look at the possibility of that cattle rustling taking place in the northwestern part of this country as being a source for the group. Because if you recall, during the pandemic, Abubakar Shekau released an audio video wherein he tried to interpreted the audio video in 4 languages, Fufude, English, Kanuri, and Hausa. And I think the whole essence is trying to reach to more persons. And in the context of Nigeria, the Northwest region has really been racked by violence, especially by bandits and cattle rustlers. And there is very large extent, people are beginning to argue that the infiltration of terrorist groups, particularly whether those affiliated to ISWAP or those affiliated to Abubakar Shekau, may play a role in the context of the escalation of cattle rustling there. That is an area we know too well that that group has exploited in order to fund its operation. With respect to the Abagana-led group, which is the ISWAP, it controls a whole lot of territory around the Lake Chad area. And so the group recently have been able to develop a very robust, complicated underground scheme that tends to leverage on the opportunities created by trading in fish as well as in pepper. They call it the red gold now. Fishes that come from the Lake Chad region account for about 75% of fish you see transported to southern Nigeria, including as far as Lagos. So in the territories where ISWAP have control, they impose certain amounts of money for those who actually fish, even per carton of fish that you are going to exploit. And also for those who also farm, they also impose levy in that direction. For those of them that are involved in cattle rearing, they impose a levy called Hadaya. That's a particular levy for those involved in pastoralism, and they pay it per cattle. In other words, if you have 5,000 cattle, the rest assured you are going to pay much more higher than someone also who has about just 1, 2, or 3, or 4. But in the very large extent, I think that is the direction where the group have actually exploited funding in this period, is to tax the territory where they control, but also to engage in looting, particularly cattle roasting. Again, let me conclude on this point to say, I think there's also an emerging suspicion around the intelligence and security cycle that the increase in illegal resource extraction, particularly gold mining in Northwest, may perhaps be another area that Boko Haram or any of its splinter groups are actually generating money. And that should be very, very possible, particularly if you understand the trajectory of the Boko Haram. I recall that the splinter group in 2012, the one they call Ansaru, moved and tried to operate in the Northwest. So with the connections these groups have, it is also very possible that the money they are generating from illegal mining, particularly gold mining in the Northwest, may be actually being funneled back to the Northeast. Remember also, and let me conclude on this note, remember also that we are dealing with groups that are as intelligent as our security personnel. And so they might decide to engage in activities where they can generate resources without necessarily causing the kind of attention and overwhelming presence of security forces that could actually dismantle, dictate, or actually disrupt such funding. But for me, I think taxing the people in the territory they control remain a major source of funding for this group in this difficult time of COVID. So I think I can stop here. Do you still want me to talk about that group, the mercenary? I think let me stop here.
Yeah, thank you so much, Freedom. Anyone can always, of course, continue the conversation if they want to engage directly. Simon, I want to hand it over to you to hear your views on how Al-Shabaab are funding their activities in these difficult times or unusual.
Yeah, thank you, Martini. I think that's a very pertinent question. And as I said, I think there is a lot we don't know, especially with the COVID-19, where information gathering has really become a big challenge, especially when you depend more on human interaction and human intelligence for that matter. But I think we can make some hypotheses that, as we have said, these groups are very pragmatic. And Dr. Freedom has really dealt with this extensively. But we would add that these groups are very pragmatic. They also understand that even the communities that they're taxing are also hard hit. So we would say perhaps they have adopted a more lenient and understanding approach. And perhaps this has interfered with their resources in terms of how much they're able to tax people. So we would perhaps hypothesize that they are suffering a little bit more in terms of finances as they understand, and they keep that element of winning the hearts and minds of people by being understanding, by not being harsh on them this period of COVID-19, by imposing hard taxes. I think, Martini, that's what I would add, but Dr. Freedom had really diverged in it deeply.
Great. I want to give Michael also the chance to make a quick remark if he wants on this one.
Yeah, just I thoroughly agree with both Dr. Freedom and Dr. Nyambura. I mean, I'd say that it is definitely too early to tell exactly what the financial fallout will be. I mean, it is worth considering that remittances, particularly to Somalia, have already started decreasing quite drastically. And given that a lot of Al-Shabaab's financial activity is embedded within the Somali economy, that could have long-term implications. But I would agree that this does create a bit of a challenge. Do they adopt a lenient approach in order to try to cultivate or maintain local support, or do they, if they're strapped for cash, impose harsher taxation measures that potentially undermine both economic incentives for recruitment and also the sort of grudging support that they sometimes receive from businesses, in areas they control. So I think, again, this sort of speaks to some of those challenges that the group's going to be facing, but it is currently too early to tell.
Great, thank you so much, Michael. I can see a couple of other questions, which is a little bit beyond the scope of this panel. So I want to ask a final question myself, which relates to my mind, the groups, they started out with a very clear communication strategy, as Dr. Freedom also mentioned, Simon Nyambura, you also mentioned, and Michael. And then as the crisis has prolonged, they have kind of also become affected themselves. So I wanted you to think about, or to reflect on, what's the next step with them? If they get more affected by the virus, maybe the finances, it's becoming less and less possible for them to get finances. So what's next? What can we expect from here? Dr. Monda, I want to hand over to you, and probably also Eric, and we'll see if we have time for one more, but we have only a few minutes left. So Dr. Monda, what can we see as the next steps from here?
That's a very good question, and a really hard one. I think one of the things that I am concerned about is the impending global economic downturn and the implications that's going to have, both in terms of the role of international actors and what they're able to bring to the table with regards to the fight against VEOs. It's also going to impact African governments in terms of the hard decisions that they are going to make. I mean, the economic crisis is going to be real. We already have over 20 African countries that are in some level of debt crisis or on the precipice of falling into a serious debt crisis. And so that's going to be an issue. And I think the others have spoken about, you juxtapose that against the ability of the VEOs themselves to be able to raise money both domestically and internationally. So where that falls out, I think is going to be very telling, and I don't have as much of a depth of analysis that Freedom and Dr. Nyambura have given in terms of that domestic source of analysis. So I think that's something that we're going to have to be looking at, just how African countries are able to manage this economic crisis. And remember too, 2019 was the year of protest across African countries. We should not see that as an isolated incident. I prefer to see it more as a film roll, a continuation. How well have governments done in terms of resolving those issues that brought millions of Africans out into the street? How is the economic crisis going to compound those issues that have not been addressed? And then how are VEOs going to leverage that dissatisfaction, both to raise monies and to recruit more people to their cause? So those are the things that I would be looking at in terms of that specific question.
Great, thank you so much. Dr. Eric Monnier-Grenard, could I ask you also to make a point on this?
Sure. The insurgency in Mozambique is still in the early stages. And as I was saying earlier, we have an information gap, I think. The COVID does not seem to have altered the dynamics of the conflict, at least so far. So this could change. Numbers are starting to rise in Mozambique, and Cabo Delgado, which is the area where the insurgency is taking place, is one of the most affected areas. So the dynamic could change in coming weeks or maybe next month. But it's hard to tell. The government does not relate the insurgency in COVID, and neither do the insurgents, who have fallen silent actually for the last month. What I think is changing at the moment is the attention that Mozambique is gaining regionally and internationally. And I think the sign that I am on this seminar is a sign of that. So the SADC has been talking about it. The Portuguese government has been pressured in Parliament to discuss Mozambique and discuss an intervention, which is not going to happen, but this is a topic. And I think that's something at some point we'll have, maybe not to give, but to move in. So I think possibly some neighboring countries will help Mozambique more effectively. Maybe the SADC will do some helping. Maybe some other country will help. I mean, I think there's quite a lot of offers to the Mozambican government, and in part, I think it is a matter of the government choosing who it wants to work with. But there is the topic which we referred to before, which is the private military contractors. And there's a strong suspicion that Eric Prince is behind the South African private military contractor who's there at the moment, and that he's trying to fly his helicopters from Libya and some of his men to try to invest in Mozambique. And there's quite a suspicion that this might be the way it goes, but maybe not. But I think this is really what we are looking into. The next step is kind of who's going to help more. And then symmetrically, I suppose, the question is how the insurgent are going to respond to the increased pressure. They seem to have fragmented at the moment to smaller groups, smaller attacks in more remote areas. They could spread, they could get more support from ISIS or some other international partner. But I think eventually what we're looking at is an increase in insurgency and the violence taking place.
Yeah, unfortunately. Dr. Friedan, Onu, I think we can have just a 1 minute reflection from you before we unfortunately have to wrap up. Any thoughts on what's next from here in your view?
Well, it may sound depressing, but for me, I think head or tail, the jihadi violence virus nexus may likely benefit the jihadis. And let me tell you why I said so. Of course, you know, as state actors, we will be interested in communicating the number of infected persons, the number of persons that are recovered, and the number of deaths, which is out there for the jihadis to interpret for their own purposes. For the jihadis, we don't know their number yet. Even if they lose their members, we don't know whether they were killed by natural death or by COVID or any other disease. And rest assured that these guys are not going to communicate this to the outside world. But more importantly, the jihadis always have to answer to every question. If the person dies of COVID, they will always tell you that he has been martyred. If you kill the person, they will also tell you that he's martyred, which makes it a very difficult challenge for us. But we are not going to give up. I think that the most important thing is for us to ramp up capacity abroad, across the broad spectrum of counterinsurgency operation. We need to ramp up our capacity in governance to be able to deliver the services that the people are in need, and also reduce the potentials of people being recruited to violent extremist groups. I think also we need to ramp up our military capacity, particularly in terms of building our mobility assets, to be able to respond to distress calls, but more importantly also to carry out preventive actions against this group. And also we need to also professionalize our security forces. That's very, very important. Going forward, the way and manner in which we handle the situation caused by the virus would determine whether we are going to benefit from it or we are going to create more problems for us. But head or tail, the rest assured that jihadis are out there looking in the corner and hoping to benefit and exploit the situation. That would be my last word. Martinez, back to you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I think we, by that, have concluded our panel. I want to sincerely thank all of you panelists. It was a really great panel. I enjoyed it, and I hope all of our participants enjoyed it. And I'm sure all of the panelists are willing to engage if you should have more questions you want to ask privately. But you know, we can't give a hand of applause, but at least I want to thank you all for joining and making your remarks. Thank you, everyone.
Yeah. They're trying to join us. No indication there.
Morning.
No. They try the trend now. Will be official for trouble. And now we stand set for the president. And the customer. Hello, do you hear me? Do you hear me? Can I speak now? Yes, okay. Well, thank you for inviting me to address this seminar on the topic of resolving old and new conflict, the need for robust conflict resolution and peaceful mechanisms for our continent. This is a very crucial need, and it's a happy coincidence that the celebration of our Union Day, African Union Day, is also on the theme of silencing the guns, creating conducive conditions for Africa's development. This is a very necessary first step for us to really talk of serious development and transformation, economic and social transformation of our big continent. We all know that our continent is so big, encompassing about 55 countries of varied backgrounds and stages of development. We need to, however, come to share a vision of the future that would benefit our peoples through the length and breadth of our continent. And how do we do it? The first step, of course, is achievement of stable peace and also a resolution of protracted conflicts, some dating back through tribalism, religion, colonial umbilical cord attachments, which still linger, and also manipulative geopolitics, manipulated from outside our continent by interests that are really at variance with the interests of our continent and our peoples. And how do we do this? How do we achieve this robust mechanism you are talking about? I would say that we start off with getting or giving ourselves informed leadership, leadership that really appreciates the forces that are at work on our continent, and which more often than not operates against our interests. So that is one. And the second is ensuring that our constitutions are really pragmatic and real. Constitutions acknowledge and enshrine the sanctity of the African individual as humanity. Humanity demanding dignity and respect as such. When we respect and our constitutions enshrine this dignity of us as human individuals, then when we talk democracy, we are talking seriously about power issuing from the individual to the governors. It is through this too that we can demand true accountability and transparency of our leaders. And when the leaders accept these principles, then I tell you, inclusiveness will become the order of the day. The nations and peoples will not be divided along the lines of tribe or religion or gender or any vested interests. They would work to ensure that truly Africa belongs to the Africans, and that our governments and other interests operating on our continent operate always with due regard for the centrality of the human African. That is also very important. The other things engendering some of the conflicts and now terrorism is the fact that our continent is rapidly becoming so populous that it's estimated by end of the century, our population would be as many as about 2 billion plus. We've become perhaps the most populous continent on the planet. Unfortunately, because we've been sort of tied down by history to be raw material producers without adding value to what we produce, and we produce not even for ourselves, always for outside. We do not have the gainful employment that our educated youth, the teeming youth, who are now majority of population on the continent, can look forward to gainful employment. And so these are very intelligent, healthy youth, but they tend to be idle hands. And we know the adage, which is that the devil finds work for idle hands. This is where the exploiters find the fodder to feed conflicts and also terrorism that are becoming prevalent in many, many areas of our continent. You look at South Africa, Southern Africa, I should say, not just South Africa. You look at some parts of Eastern Africa, you look at some parts of West Africa, and of course into the north too. We have conflicts, but we need the peace, without which we cannot talk of meaningful development and look ahead to be part of the mainstream of globalization, which is also a reality. These are very important things. To me, I believe the other thing to do to ballast our search for peace, lasting peace, and also the reduction of conflicts is wealth creation. Wealth creation means attraction of investments, both from within and from outside. Without the investments, you don't generate the wealth. But it is when we have the wealth, increasing wealth, sustainable wealth, that we can give the jobs to the teeming youth who must be encouraged to prepare themselves really to take charge of the future of the continent and into sustainability. So wealth creation. And since we still sit on wealth and yet remain poor, because naturally, if you are talking of arable lands, it's generally known that Africa alone of all the continents has about 60% of the world's arable lands, meaning we can easily become the breadbasket of the entire peoples of the globe. If it's mineral resources, talk of oil, talk of gold, talk of the strategic minerals like platinum, uranium, and so forth and so on. Africa can compare with any other continent. Water courses we have, even the deserts. Look at what late Gaddafi did by drilling under the Sahara Desert to give his country the underground river. We have all this, and yet we suffer the stigmatization of poverty and not development. And so we must find all these to ensure that our youth will not become or be exploited for mercenary causes into serving the ends of interests that may not even be African, whether through religion, whether through corporate interests that does not coincide with African interests. These are the things I believe your efforts should focus on, some of the things. And I'm happy that you invited me. But I would also add that our continent is so big and is so diversified in terms of background. We all talk Africa because of the geographic continent, Africa. And of course, because of blackness, our pigmentation of skin. When people talk Africa, they think of the black person. But that's not enough. Our continent should show and share interests of now and into the future. And how do we share? How do we know? We have the African Union, which is giving leadership. I'm happy when you look at the constitutive act of the Union, which prescribes good governance, rule of law, respect for human rights, respect for private initiative, and also has set up the new Partnership for Africa's Development. It's all in the right direction for us to leapfrog into the mainstream of globalization. Good. But still, when you stop the average African, anywhere, whether in West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa, or Northern Africa, and you ask such a person about the other parts of Africa, even within their neighborhoods, I tell you, very likely you would see that that person is very ignorant of what Africa is, except that Africa is the continent of the black people, and that Africa is poor and is rife with diseases and that sort of thing. That's not good enough. So how do we overcome this ignorance, if I may use the word? I would say that formal education is crucial, but formal education tends to take a long time. But in the short to medium term, we need to have media communication. And thankfully, through the internet age, communication has become easy, which would be managed purposefully to inform people across the length and breadth of the continent. I'm engaged currently with some groups to try to establish what we describe as Africa's public interests media initiative. The whole idea is to get such an institution to beam through satellites and whatever technology we can command, to conscientize the peoples everywhere to see the common heritage the continent endows all of us with. So we can then begin to see that the principles of governance are shared among all of us, whether you are Southern African, we get to know ourselves better. So when we talk Africa, it's not just the geographical continent and our blackness, but the humanity of the peoples of this continent. So those of us who would be privileged to become leaders among us would lead us with conscience, would truly become servant leaders of us, and would work like missionaries, seeing the brightness, the bright future that Africa really is entitled to. When we do this, I tell you, the search for stable peace, the reconciliations that we must have in spite of, say, our tribal backgrounds and in spite of the artificial boundaries imposed on us through colonialism, in spite of the religions that we haven't really researched into much. Well, all of them will take second seats behind the common humanity entitled to dignity and respect of leadership and beyond Africa, of our continent. Through this, I believe we can get to the objects that the seminar is contributing to search for. So thank you for inviting me and doing me the honor to come and open this seminar. Thank you very much.
afternoon, good evening. My name is Linnea Masuku. I'm the director of RUSI Nairobi. I'm chairing the next session from Nairobi, Kenya. I am pleased to welcome you to session 3, Resolving Old and New Conflict, the Need for Robust Conflict Resolution and Peace-Building Mechanisms. Today's panel is meant to be an exploration of regional conflict, as well as the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16, also known as SGD 16, in the context of the expertise of the panelists within East Africa. SGD 16 is one of 17 Sustainable Development Goals established by the United Nations in 2015 with the aim of achievement by 2030. The overall aim of SGD 16 is to significantly reduce all forms of violence and related death throughout the world by promoting peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, providing access to justice, rule of law for all, and building effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions at all levels. SGD 16 represents the first time that a quantitative target for violence prevention takes pride of place in multilateral global development agenda. It's based on collecting data and measuring conflict and nonviolence, urban and criminal violence, interpersonal violence, human rights violations and mass atrocities, and countering violent extremism. So today's conversation will include the ways that SGD 16 has enhanced or not platforms for coordination at national, local, and sub-regional levels, the impact of COVID-19 on the ability of conflict-affected and fragile states and regional multilateral bodies such as the African Union, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development to support such efforts towards peace, justice, institutions, as well as inclusive societies in spite of the pandemic. We will also discuss opportunities that COVID-19 has presented as regards to capacity building and support of measuring progress on SGD 16, greater reliance perhaps on multilateral regional bodies or engagement with non-traditional peace and justice actors, or for other innovations and approaches to peace and justice and inclusivity. So I'm going to briefly introduce the panelists, and when I've finished my introductions, each panelist is going to provide their opening remarks. Following this, we'll open the floor for questions from the audience, and you can submit your questions at any point using the Q&A function. And we will try very hard to make sure that we are including as many questions as possible. Please indicate when you do ask questions where you are, where in the world you are attending this webinar from. So with that, please allow me to introduce the panelists. Our first panelist is His Excellency, Ambassador Guillaume Kavaruganda. Ambassador Kavaruganda is the Rwandan Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation's Director General in charge of Europe, the Americas, and international organizations. He has served the government of Rwanda in a variety of capacities. He was a first secretary at the Rwandan Embassy in Washington, D.C., a counselor at the Rwandan Embassy in Switzerland, and he's also served as the Director of Protocol and an expert on Northern European affairs. He will be followed by our next panelist, Dr. Jonas Adai, who may dial in a little bit late. He'll be joining us from Addis Ababa, and his power just went out. So he's in search of another location with a generator. Dr. Jonas leads the Institute for Peace and Security Studies at Addis Ababa University. He is an assistant professor of peace and security studies at the same university. Among his accomplishments, he is involved in the Global Citizenship Education Program, where he contributes to a curriculum focused on transformative pedagogy meant to create a global peace culture. He also has done a great deal of research on conflict complexifiers in Ethiopia with the focus on the Ethiopia-Sudan border. Finally, Dr. Jonas has a PhD in peace studies from University of Bradford. Our third and final panelist is Hallelujah Luli Wandimu, who is the director of the Institute for Strategic Affairs. He has led the Amani Africa Media and Research Services, an independent policy research think tank. And for many years, he conducted research for the Institute for Security Studies. He's also served as an advisor to the Ethiopian Prime Minister. He is frequently cited in publications such as The Economist, The New York Times, the BBC, and the Financial Times. Finally, he's a graduate of the London School of Economics and Political Science, and he's also joining us from Addis Ababa. Over to you, Ambassador Kavaruganda.
Msuku for giving me the floor.
Ambassador, you're on mute.
Thank you for giving me the floor.
Ambassador, if you can hear me, you are on mute.
Yeah, I'm mute. Is it okay now? I think it's okay. So I was saying, thank you for giving me the floor, and I thank you, moderator, for organizing this dialogue. And allow me to recognize as well the panelists, Dr. Jonas Adai, Hallelujah Will, and Mr. Rashid Abdi. I have 4 observations regarding this discussion regarding on all the new conflict and peace building mechanism. This to better understand the reason why we do what we do, why Rwanda behave the way we do. One, the first observation is Rwanda is a very small country, landlocked, overpopulated with 12 million inhabitants, surrounded by huge countries such as the Democratic Republic of Congo in the west, Tanzania in the east, and Uganda in the north. It is not easy to feel at ease when you are a small country with big neighbors around you, and not always we are good, and not always we are in good terms. So your diplomacy, when you are a small country surrounded by big ones, your diplomacy and defense must be excellent in order for you to survive. All these facts, I mean, small, landlocked, overpopulated, hilly, make us a very fragile state in terms of peace and security. So as a Rwandese, we have to work hard and differently. The second issue is, in 1994, in Rwanda, the genocide against the Tutsi occurred. It claimed over 1 million of our population. We know better than most the price of peace and security by experience. When we talk about conflict, we know all its implications. The third observation is being a small country and overpopulated, and being among the least developed countries or poor countries. In times of COVID-19, we had no other option than to be among the top African country to do the confinement. It was, yes, a tough decision to make, a tough decision politically, but it was a wise one in terms of health and safety for our people. We still have some restrictive measures due to the COVID-19. The last observation is, in Rwanda, we believe in interdependency. We support regional integration. We strongly believe that multilateralism is the best way in solving old and new conflict. Thank you, Runia Msuku. Back to you, Runia.
Thank you, Ambassador Kavaruganda. Over to you, Hallelujah.
Thanks, Lunia. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning for everyone. Thanks once again for inviting me to be part of this distinguished panel and to discuss this very timely topic. I think before addressing the major topic of this this webinar, I think we have to look at the trends of violence and conflicts on the continent in the past 20, 30 years. One thing that's clear is, of course, the nature of conflicts have been changing in the past 2 decades. From civil wars, from violent confrontations and coups, the role of non-state actors has increased significantly in the past decade and a half. And recently, especially in the past decade, we've witnessed unprecedented level of popular uprisings, protests, and social movements demanding an inclusive and accountable government, demanding social and economic justice across the continent. And we can mention, for example, even recently, we've seen that in Algeria, in Sudan and Ethiopia witnessed change in government because of such movements. Zimbabwe, Gambia also witnessed such movements in the past few years. So there's a clear shift that we see in this, in conflict patterns and social movements across the continent. And specifically when you come to the current period, of course, we still have a lot of conflicts taking place across the continent, but the one other trend that must be put, in consideration in discussing peace and security trends on the continent is the increasing role of middle powers and external actors in peace talks, peace mediations, and political processes in the continent. Especially if you look at the political peace, processes in transitions in the Horn of Africa. There is an increasing role and an increasing involvement of international actors and especially middle powers in these places. And with the arrival of the COVID-19 crisis, we witnessed, the vulnerability and fragility of the African states, especially the one that are passing through violent conflict or the one that's passing through transitions. And first thing, of course, we witnessed that Africa, recorded a relative economic development and growth in the past 20 years. And the biggest threat COVID poses for our continent and for the peace and security of the continent is it threatens this game. There is a high possibility, and there is a high possibility that tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions, could be pushed back to poverty if this crisis continues, and this may further instigate another rounds of protests, riots, and demonstrations, creating instability across the continent. And attempts by some African countries to, for example, to lock down as a way of preventing the spread of COVID. It proved to be risky in many ways. First, it has most people live on daily wages across especially in the urban areas, and it was proved that in most places across the continent, 85% of people working in the informal sector were out of jobs when the lockdowns were implemented. But at the same time, it also exposed the weakness of the African state to deliver basic services and the weakness in providing basic health services, sanitation, and it also exposed, the economic foundations and structures of most African states. We've witnessed, for example, the debate taking place in Kenya when there was a conversation about lockdowns and how many people do have, access to running water or proper sanitation and toilets facilities. So it also distracted, beyond the structural challenges, I think it also distracted the state from investing in long-term projects, investing on other economic and development objectives, and in many places it also emboldened terrorist groups. We witnessed rise in terrorist attacks and activities and movements in the Sahel, in Mozambique, of course in the areas attacked by Boko Haram, and even here in the Horn, we've also witnessed the revival of the Al-Shabaab. And it has also significantly weakened the movement of peacekeeping missions, threatened mediation and peace talks and transitional processes. One best example is, the South Sudan unity government. That process is now being threatened by the COVID-19, And it also threatens transitions. If you ask right now, where are the two most exciting political transitions taking place in the continent? It is Sudan and Ethiopia. And those two political transitions are now threatened by COVID-19. From the perspective of Sudan, I think the economic challenge posed by COVID-19 has significantly raised the frustration of the mass. And in Ethiopia, with the postponement of the election, that was seen as the most important event, the most important milestone of the ongoing political and democratic transition. Political tensions are rising. We also witnessed, rise in popular uprisings and protests across the continent. Just to give you one fact, one figure, the 2020 was, 15 elections were scheduled on the continent for 2020. Some of them were held, some of them are postponed, and some of them are uncertain. So postponement of elections raises, a lot of questions about the legitimacy, both the electoral, constitutional, legal legitimacy of governments. So it's another potential for conflicts, both in countries passing through transition, and even in stable countries, it could be a cause for crisis. And the other challenges, of course, with the economic crisis that followed the COVID-19 crisis, the global economic recession, commitment for peacekeeping, peace talks, and peace processes for Africa could be threatened. This, of course, could also be an opportunity, because the push for, alternative financing and trying to draw resources for African peace security agenda from the continent could embolden the talk. The calls for local and African source of financing for peace and security projects across the continent. But in the short term, it may create a serious impact on peacekeeping missions, peace processes across the continent. And in some countries across the continent, we witnessed the securitization of the response to COVID-19. We've seen the police, the army at the forefront of responding to, the government response, to the COVID crisis. And if that continues after COVID-19, it may threaten democratization, and it may, it may add additional roles for the military and security apparatus in politics and public life, and that's not desirable in any functioning and transitional democracy. But it's not all bad in my view. I'll conclude with some of the opportunities that emerged. The first one is, of course, in some countries, as I said, the government may use this opportunity, because one thing that's clear is it's only the government, it's only the state that has the mandate, the capacity to mobilize resources and to lead efforts and coordinate efforts to COVID-19. So some countries are trying to entrench their control and entrench their power, but in others, we witnessed governments reaching out to the civil society, working with the opposition, civil society, the media, to respond, in a coordinated manner. And such, initiatives could be used as an opportunity for a much broader, a much bigger national dialogue or national consensus, or political conversations between the opposition and the government. So that could be seen as an opportunity. And of course, the need for a strong and effective state has resurfaced in political debates, because not only in countries, in fragile countries, or in the African continent, but even in strong countries and liberal political economies, people have recognized that a strong government, an effective government, is needed for the stability of a country. And I'll stop with, my last point would be, this crisis also showed that any peace and security efforts, any attempt to end violence or to build a strong state depends on providing basic services to citizens. So social and economic rights, the rights that I've mentioned earlier, for example, access to health services, access to clean housing and clean living conditions, access to toilets and running water, have resurfaced as critical and a major part of political agenda in the country, not only in the political agenda but in peace and security processes across the continent. So it's overall it's mixed, but and no doubt that COVID-19 will pose a significant political and security challenge for the continent, because we're still in the middle of it, and the end is yet to be seen. But there are also opportunities that could provide with ways to change the old ways of doing things. Back to you, Lunia.
Thank you for your remarks, Hala. I think that we have the start of an interesting discussion, and I do want to just remind the audience that when Dr. Jonas Adai is able to join us, we'll patch him into the conversation. Until we get Dr. Adai on the line, I did want to begin with some questions, for yourself and for Ambassador Kabaruganda. The first question that I'd like to ask for Ambassador Kabaruganda is in regards to Rwanda and civil society engagement in Rwanda, and how you might characterize the short-term impact of COVID-19 on sort of continuing civil society engagement in Rwanda, and what you see specifically as some challenges presented by COVID-19, and if you're aware of any ways that organizations and other members of civil society have tried to address those challenges and to continue, if at all possible, their engagement in spite of the pandemic. Over to you, Ambassador Kabaruganda.
Thank you very much. The discussion between the government and the civil society will still go on. But what we notice is they are not on the same level. The government is always strong. The civil society is weak. And this pandemic, this COVID, as Hallelujah was saying, will affect again the civil society, because their means most of the times comes from abroad. So we'll continue to engage them. We will do whatever we can, because as a country, we try to make the inclusiveness in all we do, because yes, it takes time. Yes, it is true that the government is representative from the government. They would like to have in order to get everything in hurry, to get the target they want. They don't like to associate the civil society, the media, the academician, and everyone, but if you don't include them, you lose time at the end. But we will continue with the civil society to engage them, but we know that the situation will not be easy as it used to be. Thank you.
Thank you for your response, Ambassador Kabaruganda. We have a question from Salisbury in the UK. Actually, from someone from Salisbury, UK, but lives in Nairobi. And they work for the British Peace Support Team here in Nairobi. Their question is, what role does the African Union's African Standby Force play in regional and continental peace and security? What is your view of the African Standby Regional Force's capability and the AU's willingness to deploy it? And I will direct that question towards Hala.
Thank you, Lunia. I mean, as you know, the transformation from the OAU to the AU was anchored in building the peace and security capabilities of the African Union. And of course, one of the flagship initiatives of the African Union is the African Standby Force. But as I said earlier, the process, its official launch is yet to come in a way. there are still ongoing debates on the structure, the size, the management of the African standby force and its use and deployment across the continent. And as you know very well, they were the rapid deployment, arrangement was in a way an attempt to fill the gaps of, the structural gaps of the African standby force. And as I said earlier, I mean, right now the African Union is passing through a rethinking of the APSA, the African Security Architecture, which the African standby force is an element. And that should include, in a way, the issue that I've mentioned earlier, the changing nature of conflicts. So in a way, how can the African standby force and how can the bigger, African security architecture can fit into, the changing nature of conflicts, which is increasingly moving towards, social movements, popular uprisings, and terrorist movements and innocent actors. And I believe the way the African standby force was designed and conceptualized, a decade and a half ago, definitely needs rethinking at this point. Of course, we have regional brigades, as building blocks of the African standby force, and of course there were some attempts to deploy them, but right now still, I mean, how will that rhyming that with the United Nations peacekeeping deployment guides and principles, and ensuring the sustainable funding systems, I think are still under discussion, and I don't think they will be resolved anytime soon. Back to you, Dunia.
Thank you, Hala. I think I would like to direct the next question towards Ambassador Kabaruganda. The next question for you is about sort of any flaws or gaps that you see in the international system. And this is sort of a follow-on question to the previous question that was posed to you regarding Rwandan civil society. And your response, part of your response included a reliance on international support. Within that, and sort of that being challenged in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Within that framework, as far as your understanding is, have there been any particular opportunities that you've seen for those that are reliant on international aid and funding for their engagements in the country to pursue alternative ways of engaging the community and carrying out some of their work in spite of the pandemic, as well as in spite of what many of us across the world and the continent in different sectors will see in terms of a potential drop in funding for a variety of different initiatives, especially given that governments don't have the same levels of funding that they're able to give to support, as well as a variety of organizations. So over to you, Ambassador Kabaruganda.
Yeah, yes. We can, yes, the money is a big issue, of course, but we can look at Rwanda. We have what we call the homegrown solutions. Let's say when we face the genocide against the Tutsi, we have 1 million of our people. To go to the courts, it will take 100 years to clean the people. So we will have to, on that issue on civil society, we will have to look for other ways of doing things with less money, yes, and what can be what can replace that kind of financial aspect. Probably in Rwanda, probably we'll try to see if the government, instead of international community, can help them. If they can, let's say, find for them, if they lose, let's say, their rent, if we can accommodate them in our ministries and in other institutions, we would find, in any case, a way of helping them, because it is not even helping them, it is helping ourselves, because what they do is complementarity with what we do. I don't know if I answered correctly of your question, and back to you. but I'm willing to come back again on it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Ambassador. I believe that you did answer the question. The next question that I have is posed to the two of you, which really takes us back to SGD 16 and sort of another sort of major portion of our conversation today. So is SGD 16 an effective way to address the drivers of violence in both Rwanda as well as Ethiopia, or Hala, if you'd like to expand that to the Horn of Africa? And does SGD 16 effectively address institutions that have, in some cases, been failing societies? And is it a way that we can look at advancing the peace agenda for civil society, again, within Rwanda as well as Ethiopia? And Hala, if you might begin.
I'll build on what I have mentioned earlier in a way, and that is, the past few years, the past 2 decades witnessed, unprecedented economic development and growth in the African continent, and that growth has created uneducated youth that has better education than their parents, a youth that can easily organize and mobilize, a youth that can articulate its political and economic demands. So in a way, most of the demands of this demographic boom, I believe, is anchored in the economic demands and economic inclusion. So in a way, the issue of the peace and security agenda has reached a level where it can no more be separated between from the demands of the youth, because in the past few people can start rebel movements, or a few groups could run a coup. But right now, the demand, the biggest source of instability in most countries on the continent is the unemployed youth, which is demanding for better lives, which is demanding for better inclusion, both economically and politically. So peace processes, security processes, political processes, I believe, should anchor their initiative in addressing that long-term and structural demands of the youth within the framework that you've mentioned.
Thank you, Hala. Ambassador Kavaruganda, if I could pose the same question to you.
Yes. With SDG 16, we have lots of variety. We intend lots of